Namaskar. Today I have with me Sri Mohan Sonti, and we are in for an intellectual look, an in-depth look, I should also say, at whole eating habits of people. And whenever there is talk about ban on cow slaughter in India, all of us Indians, we go on the defensive. We are always saying, oh well, it is like a mother, it is this, it is that. We have looked at this thing in a more holistic manner, looking at various regions. What are the reasons why some animal is forbidden but the other one is allowed? All sorts of stuff like that. And we have compiled this data here, which will essentially help you understand that there are many contradictions in many countries, and it's hope that you use this data to at least tell them, look, it's not as if we are alone being choosy in our animals. What about you? What do you say for this? So we have to start learning to do purva paksha, so that we understand and we tell them, look, you don't tell us what it is, tell us what this is how your laws are. So a bit of a what I would call as an in-depth discovery of all these laws across the world. And we are going to start, of course, with the United States, which is where the most of the data is. So now I would like to welcome Mohan Kumar Sonti ji. Mohan ji, namaskar and welcome to PGurus channel. How are you?
Namaste, Shriji. So, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, sir. Always a pleasure having conversations with you. Every time we do something, we take the thing and rip the thing inside out, take a look at the raw guts, and then put it back together and get the big picture again. So I'm looking forward to this presentation from you. So the floor is yours, sir. Over to you.
Gee. So this actually took a lot of time for me to put together all this data and everything and go through all of those laws and the history and things like that. So this whole idea is to make sure people are equipped with the right knowledge of different eating habits and how they came about across the world. So that way we know exactly what is happening elsewhere and where we stand today. So this topic is about the food, and I'll be focusing more on the cows, dogs, and the pigs. So it's basically, there are a lot of issues in Bharat, like you have mentioned, about the cow slaughter and things like that. And many times we tend to be on the defensive. But this presentation is about, full research is about understanding all the nuances, the history, the background, and how we stand and where we stand today, right, regarding all the countries. Okay, so we'll start with that. So in general, there are eating prohibitions in across the world, and these laws vary a little bit. But typically, people don't eat national animals. That is generally a given. It is not necessary, but in general, in many countries, they tend to follow some of these rules. The national animals, exotic animals, and wild animals are typically prohibited from eating. But regarding the domestic animals, there are various rules and regulations in different countries. But our focus is going to be on the cows, which is beef, the dogs, which is called fragrant or blockade mutton, and then the pigs, which is the pork. The sources that I have, you can always go back to the slide and always look at it. It is the government of USA, and there's several sources from government of USA, government of India, the source from the Bible, the NGOs, the university, the media, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and some of the common knowledge that you will find everywhere, and some of the dog care organizations, which has put together a lot of extensive history of all of these things. So these are some of the sources. But in general, you can find all this information. They're all very authentic. I put a lot of time and effort to make sure all these are authentic and they are lined up from different multiple sources. All right. So let us try to understand what is the issue with, when we talk about the beef, the cow slaughter, that becomes a very huge issue in the world. So all the countries, many organizations and people and communities, they suddenly up in arms and they always talk about how can Bharat ban cow slaughter and things like that. But the story is actually more than that. If you understand the background, the history of how other people treat their animals, right? So we'll start with the dogs part, which is because the Europe and USA, particularly the USA, is leading this effort about, many of the NGOs, and many of them are actually funded by America and also by Europe, about the ban on the cow slaughter. So we'll start with what is dog meat, right? And so this is where the whole story starts, right? So the dogs, they're mentioned in Bible. So Old Testament mentions about dogs about 32 times. They are in all those segments, the Exodus, Deuteronomy, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Jobs, and Psalms, and all of that. In New Testament, they refer to dogs 9 times. It comes in Matthew, Mark, Luke, Philippians, and Peter, Revelation. Now, consistently, the description that you would find in Bible, and it's very consistent description among the Old Testament and the New Testament, is the dog is looked upon as something disparaging, very evil, very disgraceful or contemptuous. And that is a very consistent description. Every time they mention about a dog, that is basically what they mention. Yes, there are some people who talk about some reference, which is usually an interpretation, where it is talked about as guard dogs and things like that. But these are the references I have seen when I went through it's the standard English version of Bible. Old Testament has it 32 times, New Testament 9 times, and all of them are pretty much disparaging, evil, disgraceful, contemptuous. The description always is in that direction. So nothing is positive there. Then, what is the food in Bible? You see, the whole Europe and America are fundamentally Christian countries, or at least that was their entire history. So a lot of these things affect their diet and what they eat and their sentiments. So we have seen about the dog. Now, what is the food in Bible? The Old Testament says, whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud among the animals, you may eat. This comes in Leviticus. The same thing is mentioned in Deuteronomy. So you see, this is the basis for most of that particular segment is all about the food. And I just picked one of them. Basically, this is the core of it, which says anyone parts which has a hoof, cloven-footed, and chews the cud among the animals. Those are the ones that they can eat, and the rest of them they cannot eat. So this forms the basis for what is a kosher, even among the Jews. There's additional point here that talks about all that walk on their paws among the animals that go on all fours are unclean to you. The walk on the paws are typically, you see the dogs, cats, and all of that family of animals, they walk on the paws. The horse and all of them, they walk on their basically hooves, right? So these are the basic general guidelines and rules that they have. The New Testament, however, it basically says everything is clean. Everything inside basically is clean. That's in Romans, Acts 10. It's mentioned in 2 places in different variants. This particular phrase comes from the Romans, but Acts 10 also has something similar, which indicates that you can eat anything. What is created by God is clean. Now, why did this change come about in New Testament? So Old Testament is clear, that is for the Jews. So that's why they have kosher, and their rules are very clear on what they can and cannot eat. Now, the dog meat in Europe. So how it evolved is basically the Greeks and Romans, the pigs are part of their economy, diet, ritual. It's an integral part of their society for everything. So they cannot let go of pigs. So from Judaism, when the Christianity came in, there was a dispute when they were spreading, and these kind of dietary restrictions about the hooves, the Leviticus that we talked about in Deuteronomy, was very difficult to implement. That's where you got the New Testament, where they said everything is clean, you can eat what you want, because they wanted to spread the message of Jesus and New Testament. And therefore, they gave some sort of an opening door and said, you can eat what you want. So let that not be the barrier. So that is basically the change. But still, the dogs, which they typically, all the native cultures had dogs, they have domesticated them almost tens of thousands of years ago. That disparaging and contemptuous idea of the dog still remained, right? So basically, they did mention them as the domesticated ones and the guards, but in general, for the pigs, which has a very important element in the Greek and Roman culture, so they opened the door and said, okay, continue having that. So pigs got back. The pork is back in the menu. But dogs, there's nothing very clear about it, except for the fact that it's something dirty, unclean, and it's basically something disparaging. When somebody calls someone a dog, it's basically something that is disparaging. So that's how all the Bible is about. Now, in Europe, eating dog meat, yes, it is never the so-called the mainstream, as in it is not like part of the regular diet, but it is widely prevalent till the 1900s. Even after the mid-1900s, it's widely prevalent. Like it is in Austria, Spain, Hungary, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, and many of these countries, it was widely prevalent, right? In Germany, for example, in 1982, the dog meat was about 50 marks per kg, whereas the beef and pork was 1.5 marks per kg. That's almost 3 times more expensive. Now, there are different, and Germany actually banned eating dog meat in 1986. But if you look at the history in the last few centuries, it is not that usually it is very difficult to breed any carnivorous animals in large numbers for the regular food. So it tends to be these herbivorous and mild-natured animals that you tend to breed and eat for food. The carnivores are very difficult to breed. So inherently, that is already a deterrence. It is not that they were not interested in eating them, but it's just that it's not convenient and easy. But where it was, like in Germany, when the prices are low, it's more about the economy, right? The prices are low. It was widely available in Germany all the way till 1960s, 70s. And even in 1982, that was the price of the dog meat. Now, there is an argument that many Westerners make that it's only during famines and when people didn't have food. That is not necessarily true, because 1970s and 80s, Germany was perhaps, I think, the third largest economy in the world, third or fourth largest economy. So they can give any excuses, but the bottom line is eating dog meat was not necessarily prohibited. It never was prohibited. It's just that the biblical idea that it is somehow disparaging and contemptuous, and the fact that it's very difficult to breed in large numbers, essentially was kind of a deterrent. Otherwise, they had no problem and no special affinity to not eat. So it is never like that. Now, Switzerland, in fact, about 3% of the people eat even as of 2000s. This is because in many of the European cultures too, there are a lot of communities, traditionally they used to eat dogs. And in Switzerland, they still do it, though they are being pressurized to stop that, but they still eat that. And such enclaves exist in many parts of the Europe. Many of those countries, they stopped it only in the recent few decades. But before that, in the last few centuries, yes, it was not in the mainstream, not an everyday diet, but still it was widely prevalent and people used to eat, which means it is not some special affinity. There are other reasons on why they were not eating. Like I said, breeding them is difficult and things like that, and economy. Now, how did the transformation happen for the dogs? In Europe, the church completely disliked keeping dogs. Like we have seen in Bible, what the Bible talks about, all the verses is always disparaging. So the church always disliked keeping dogs because they think it's related to the pagan culture. Like I mentioned before, the dogs have been domesticated tens of thousands of years ago. When they talk about pagan culture, pagans, heathens, all of them are basically the native cultures. The original native cultures that are more in tune with the nature, all of them had their domesticated dogs and basically they kept them. So they had no issue with that. But church specifically has a very disparaging look towards the dogs, and therefore they dislike keeping the dogs because they believed it's unclean. In 16th and 17th century, in fact, there were witch trials in which dog was treated as a symbol of Satan, and many of them are punished for keeping the dogs. So the church never liked people keeping it. This was all the way to 16th, 17th century. Now remember that this is about the time when the church started losing grip over the society, which means people were going back to some of the native instincts, like in the native cultures. Slowly, they're using their normal native senses and say, okay, what is part of the nature? And maybe, dogs who have always been part of the human establishments, right? We had some sort of I would say like a symbiotic relationship with dogs over tens of thousands of years. Then came the dog show for the first time in Newcastle, England in 1859. The next one happened in 1863. Now, if you look at this, from being completely disparaging, not interested, I mean, it's okay. It's not that they actually had any special love for it, but they may not really like it. So other economic and other factors, so they would eat and not eat. It just goes on and off throughout their history. But then came the dog show in Newcastle, England, 1859, in 1863. In USA, now I'm not saying the correlation is a causation, but something that is very interesting as an observation, that Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863 when the slavery has ended. And then came the dog show in 1877, now enters the man's best friend, right? Like you whistle, you snap, and it'll come to you. So the pet dog popularity actually increased dramatically from the early 1900s. Now, once again, I'm not saying there is this correlation is the causation, but this is just an interesting observation that when the slavery has ended, came all these dog shows and the popularity of the pets, the dogs as pets, the man's best friend, has suddenly started rising in 1900s. So this is how the transformation happened. Now, the dog laws and the NGO in USA. The laws, going back for the last 60 years, roughly, I have seen through these laws, have downloaded them and read through parts of that. The Animal Welfare Acts and the USDA Acts, the Department of Agriculture. So they passed about 9 of them. It could be a little more. I might have missed a few, but there are about 9 of these that I came across from 1966, 70, 76, 85, 90, all the way to 2014. Now, all of these animal welfare acts that they have, all of them talk about a humane way of slaughtering them and what can be eaten, the trade, transportation, and all the details, that kind of a details. None of them specifically addressed about, it's all about what is the humane way of killing the animals and eating, right? And what is a better care for the animals too. There are a few things are related to that as well. So to me, personally, I would say a humane slaughtering is kind of an oxymoron because there's nothing humane about slaughtering. But that's fine. But in their culture, basically, they have these animal welfare acts. All of them pertain to that. But none of them actually banned eating dog meat, because they always had this idea that in times of famines and things like that, it is not that they have completely discarding it. They are okay eating it, and they have done it throughout their history. It's just not convenient, economically probably not feasible, and it is not feasible to breed the carnivorous animals. But all of those reasons aside, in general, they haven't exactly banned it per se. But came in so even as of 2017, the dog meat was banned in only 6 states in USA. And this ban is also not exactly a clear cut. In few states, it's more like if you own the dog and you kill it yourself, you can eat it, something to that effect, but you cannot sell it. And so there are variations to that, but it's only in 6 states that you have some sort of a dog meat ban as of 2017. Come 2018, you have the HR 6720, Dog and Cat Meat Trade Prohibition Act of 2018. So this is the first time they have completely banned eating dog meat. So banning of dog meat happened in the last few years to the last few decades between Europe and America. So this is all the love and everything. A lot of the narratives that you hear, these have been developed only over the last several decades. Before that, for centuries before that, from the Bible, they didn't have that kind of an affection. It's basically they had a disparaging look towards it. Now, very interesting that this particular Prohibition Act of 2018 has Section 2C, which says exception for Indian tribes. When they mean Indian tribes, I think it's probably the Native Americans or the original Americans. That's what they mean by the Indian tribes. But keep that in mind, there's an exception for that even in USA as of 2018, even though the law was passed to ban eating dog and cat meat. Now, in 1991, remember we talked about how the popularity of the pet industry has increased and people started keeping dogs as pets. Now came in 1991, an NGO called the Humane Society of the United States. Now, the Humane Society is not so much about humane to all the animals. Their target is pretty much, for the most of it, is just about the dogs and cats. So they all have all other meats and they have no issue with eating other animals. It's just that they have one special interest in just the dogs and cats. And that started in 1991. The pet industry, the pet ownership, they kept increasing in 1900s, like I said. So this is when this was formed. Then you have a Humane Society Legislative Fund, which is linked to this. It is a lobbying group. This was established in 2004, and this is now funded by the government. So now this is how you have the NGO, whose sole objective is to see that the dogs and cats are not eaten, right? So there was they started working on this specifically, and it was funded by the government. Remember the exception for Indian tribes in the law, and remember this NGO. Whose Humane Society is all about humane only to the cats and dogs, pretty much. All other animals can be eaten. Now, the dog statistics in the world. So in USA, as of 2022, about 45% households own dogs. So you see that almost half the population actually owns dogs. So now you see the link with the NGO that we talked about, the lobbying group that was formed, because half the country actually owns dogs and they really love them. Right? In fact, most of them consider them to be part of their family. This is an evolution that has happened in the last century or so, right? So what they did was, in the world, this Humane Society, there's Humane Society of International, where they established in several countries, and using these funds, they lobby in China, Korea, and all the countries, essentially asking them to ban the dog meat and the cat meat. And that's about it. It's not about any other meat. Remember, their objective is only that. So that they call it as humane. It is not a humane to all the animals, humane only to the ones that they actually love. It is kind of like what the Bible also has, right? What you love, everything else is edible. So, or something is contemptuous and not edible. So this is what they started lobbying in all these countries. Korea, China, and many of them have already started passing laws about not eating dog meat. When it comes to India, so in Bharat, the dog meat was banned as part of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. So we had banned it like way back, almost 50 years ago. But in the news, you will still hear about some Naga tribes and others eating. Now, remember I mentioned about 2018 Act where they made an exception to the what they called it as an Indian tribes. So it is like they have their laws where they just started. They had this ban only in 2018, and their tribes are exempted from it. But somehow here in when it comes to Bharat, even though we banned eating dog meat as per the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, there is a lot of pressure, and you will always find news articles that looks down upon Bharat and about how people still in Nagaland eat and few of those tribes eat. Right? It is about they have all of these issues, but somehow they point at Bharat for all these issues because somehow it is a free for all as far as the media goes. Now, if you look at the vegetarians in the world, India has about 40% vegetarians by many estimates. I would say another 30% or 40% are very mild meat eaters, as in they don't eat meat every single day in a large quantity. They are very mild eaters. They eat once in a while and things like that. But about 40% are already vegetarians, which means we don't kill animals. And our idea of vegetarian is fairly simple. It is not vegan. It is not about all those different definitions about the diet and what keeps me live longer and things like that. It is about compassion. In fact, our idea is about the ahimsa. So all the vegetarian idea comes from that idea of ahimsa, because animals love their life like we love our life. And that is the bottom line. And therefore, we don't want to kill animals and eat them. So that way we have about 40%. Europe has about 5 to 10%. USA has about 4% vegetarians, right? So a country that has 4% vegetarians, remember in Bharat, we have 40%. That's 10 times more for a population that's already 3 to 4 times more. Still, USA has this humane society. In even this 4%, most of them do it for dietary reasons with the hope that they can live longer and healthier and things like that. All are good reasons, but I'm just saying those are the main reasons, and not the entire 4% has anything to do with compassion. So their compassions are very, very selective. Very few areas that they pick. 96% of Americans actually eat meat. In fact, they have to be told to eat at least a cup or 2 cups of vegetables. Otherwise, they really lack vegetables. That's how much meat they actually eat. And yet they have the Humane Society, they have the lobbies, and they will tell the rest of the world on what to eat and how they need to be a little more humane. Especially they give this lecture to Bharat all the time, especially the Naga tribes and all of them, despite their own laws that exempt the native Indian tribes over here. Now, we go to, so that is the whole history of how the dog meat, I would say it's almost like hypocrisy, but this is the evolution of why they stopped eating dog meat. You have seen the entire history. But somehow, when it comes to cows, we are going to address that. They have all kinds of issues. Their interest is only about the cat and dogs, as we have seen, even though they are absolutely voracious meat eaters. Now we come to the Islamic countries, the pigs and pork in Islamic countries. We go back to the Old Testament, which is the baseline for almost all the Abrahamic religions, right? So they have that idea of kosher, the one that we have seen from Leviticus, which evolved into a halal. So all of the things in the Old Testaments are very similar in Quran too, because Old Testament is also valid text for them, and they move to Quran, which is an updated text. They have the similar idea, the parts, the hoof, the cloven-footed, choose the cud, and it's basically similar idea. And therefore, they too dislike, if you look at it in Leviticus 11.7, and the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. And therefore, they don't eat pigs because they know it is unclean. You ask anyone, they will tell you the one single point is it's unclean, as if all other animals were clean. I mean, the way it is processed today, any animal is as clean as any other animal. But this is the baseline as per the Leviticus, and the same idea is carried over in Quran as well. And therefore, they don't eat pig. And remember, even the Jews don't eat pig because it's in the Old Testament. For Christians, Because pig was very integral part of the Greek and Roman culture, the only way they can get into it is when they had to add a line that said everything that God created must be clean. So they had to give a door open so that they can enter and bring in Christianity into Europe. Now the pig meat which is pork, is prohibited in all Islamic countries. We have seen that the dog meat is prohibited in most of the Europe and in America in the last years to few decades. Pig is prohibited in all the Islamic countries. But Bakrid, which is the feast of sacrifice, 𝗣𝗚𝗍𝗍, this is the largest single day slaughter of animals on earth. Right? When I talked about humane slaughter, I thought was an oxymoron. But this is where I found that it probably made some sense, because there are also cruel ways of killing the animals. And it is done in the most cruelest possible way, by slitting the throat and letting it bleed. So now that humane slaughter makes probably some sense in this culture, because they evolved from the point where they were also non-humane slaughters. Now, what is it about cows in Bharat? So the Vedas, the cows are revered for over 5,000 years in Bharat. And this is the most conservative estimate. The Vedas could have been written even several thousand years before that. So this is very important in our culture for thousands of years. And it is revered as one of the most, because Bharat is an agrarian society. In fact, as of 2011 census, 70% is still rural. Only 30% is urban. Which means traditionally for thousands of years, cow has always been an integral part of our culture as part of the agrarian society. And we take good care of them, and that is very important to us. And it has always been important and revered throughout our history for thousands of years. Now, the Constitution, in the Directive Principles of State Policy, Article 48 says, this was from after the independence, when the Constitution was written in 1950, it says, organization of agriculture and animal husbandry, that is a segment, in particular, take steps for preserving and improving the breeds and prohibiting the slaughter of cows and calves and other milch and draught cattle. Now, the Constitution, Article 48, already says that we have to prohibit the slaughter of cows and calves. Right? This is already clear in the Constitution. When people talk about should we have the laws to ban cow slaughter in Bharat, it's already in the Constitution. You don't need a law. It has the highest law is the Constitution. It's already written in that. Article 48 already says that. So what really happened was basically the governments after that, it's actually Congress government, if I just have to tell the name, basically they completely floated and ignored the constitutional directive. This actually comes in the Directive Principles of State Policy. They have completely ignored the Constitution. Yes, they do talk about protecting Constitution, but this is what they did. Yes, Shriji.
I just wanted to clarify. I think you meant flouted, not floated.
Flouted, yeah. Yes. Okay. Basically, they completely discarded. They discarded whatever is written in the Constitution, and they went ahead and they continued with the cow slaughter. They went ahead with everything, which is completely disregarding whatever the law, the highest law of the land, the Constitution says, Article 48. So do we need new laws to ban the cow slaughter? These laws are going to be subservient to the actual Constitution, which already states that they cannot be slaughtered. So this is our background for the cows in Bharat. Now, why did that happen? This is going to be, this is a little bit sad here. The Bharat cow and buffalo statistics, the cara beef, people often refer to beef, but it's actually the cara beef that comes from Bharat, which is a buffalo meat. It is not a cow meat. So when people talk about Bharat being the largest producer of beef, it really isn't exactly, right? Because it is not a cow meat. It is not the beef. It is a cara beef, which is very similar. I'm not entirely in favor of it, but as the facts go, it is a buffalo meat. And it's a cara beef, which they often refer it to as beef. The word cara beef comes from caribou beef or something from 1970s, but that's what it is. We are indeed the largest producer of world. Almost 33% of world's cara beef, the buffalo meat, comes from Bharat. And we export 1.44 million metric tons as of 2022, and our domestic consumption is almost 3 million metric tons. Now, this is how they brought in the idea of beef, because the cows can't be slaughtered. They found a loophole. They started slaughtering the buffaloes, which is kind of little similar, and therefore they introduced beef into Bharat. Now, this cara beef production was almost negligible in 1950s, but somehow it picked up in 1980s, 90s. It just skyrocketed, and now we produce almost the largest, 33% largest producer of cattle beef. We export 1.44 million tons, and we consume 3 million. Now, what happened regarding the sensitivity here is, for the cows, look at the population compared to the people. In 1951, we had 155 million cows, and there were 360 million people. The ratio was 1 to 2.3. In 2012, the 155 million cows went up to 190 million cows, a 30% growth. But 360 million people went to 1.2 billion people. Today, they stand at about, this is from the census, 2011 census. The ratio is now 1 to 6.4. So basically, today the population is 1.5 billion. Essentially, the cow population grew by about 30%, the human population by about almost 300%. So essentially, that ratio has completely got skewed, and not many people, especially the urbanized. You remember how in America, once about 45% of the people started owning dogs, they suddenly fell in love with it, and they went on absolute steroids and decided the whole world must stop eating dogs. But here, what happened is the proportion of cows has actually reduced, right? It only went up from 155 million to 190 million. And to make matters worse, the pure breeds is only a fraction of those, because they introduce other cows. We have less cows, but there are more mouths to feed, there are more milk. And therefore, they started getting other hybrid cows, other cows from other countries, and they started having hybrid cows, which actually is going down the spiral, right? It's getting worse. So that is the issue. The only way we can fix this is if we can increase our own native breeds. In fact, that is part of the constitution. If we're supposed to work on that, but that is completely ignored. We are not supposed to slaughter cows, which also was ignored, and they continue doing it. And they introduced this cattle beef and alternate beef through the back channels, and now we are stuck with this. Now, in conclusion, basically the USA and Europe, what they did was they're imposing on the world their current sentiments and dietary habits. See, dog isn't unlike the cows, which were revered in Bharat for thousands and thousands of years. And for pork, the complete hatred comes from, dislike and hatred comes actually from their books, the Old Testament as well as Quran. And those were sufficient reasons for them to ban those animals. None of the Islamic countries eat pork, and the Europe and America, in fact, they banned it only in the last few years to few decades. And before that, it was not explicit ban. In the last century, they started having more and more love towards the dog because of how they started having them as pets. Before that, it was contemptuous as far as the Bible goes, and it was disparaging, but still they weren't exactly eating because it's contemptuous and unclean. But nevertheless, they would eat. It's not like it's prohibitory for them to eat, and they would eat very often. But somehow the love just increased only in the last century, and suddenly they started banning it everywhere. But to them, right now, it is about imposing the current sentiments and dietary habits. That's all that they're doing. In fact, they have no locus standi on saying what Bharat should, whether they should ban the cow slaughter or not. It's already banned. It's in the constitution. Said that is something that is revered for thousands of years. The dog came into their life only in the last 100 years. Now, this humane society that we talked about, that is not translatable to other animals. Like I said, they only focus on the dog and the cat. But this is about 96% of Americans eat meat. And many of them have to be told to eat at least a cup or 2 cups of vegetables. Otherwise, they're voracious meat eaters. And they talk about humane. And Bharat has 40% of vegetarians. So this is the other thing that we have to keep in mind when we talk about this humane society, right? The animal extirpation, extinction, and hunting for pleasure, these are very common things in Europe as well as in America, and particularly in America. Like, for example, the passenger pigeon, if people, they heard about this, there were about 3 to 5 billion of them in North America. 3 to 5 billion is the largest extent of any species in those days. Just as recently as 1800s. And in a mere 20 to 30 years, they went from being 3 to 5 billion to complete extinction. You will find some of the stuffed passenger pigeons in several museums here. If you get a chance, go and take a look at it. But it went from 3 to 5 billion, it went to extinction. And there are many reasons. It's all hunting. And for many reasons, how they hunted them to extinction. The American bison, there were about 60 million of them, and it went to a bottleneck of having just a few hundred. Today, there are about 500,000, I believe. but they all come from the same stock, the founding stock of about 100. In fact, some say the founding stock were probably 30 to 50 of those animals, so that they hunted all of them to extinction. The wolves, there were about 2 million of them, and they were again hunted to extinction, and there were only few hundred left. So they still have, after the wolves were gone, the bison, all of them are gone. Now they have the hunting licenses to contain the other animals, the deers and other animals, right? So essentially, from this culture, if you look at it, the human is not translatable. They have the the history of hunting for pleasure and just for hunting the animals to extinction, but somehow they impose on the world their current sentiments and dietary habits. So this is something the people from Bharat should know, that this is where the numbers stand, and so you are able to defend yourself with the right knowledge.
Thank you so much, Mohan Sonti ji. The takeaway from this particular video of yours is that you educate yourself. Sometimes you get cornered in conversations, and this is mostly because of people who take one data point that suits their argument and throw that at you. So you need to also be armed, and we are hoping that this 30-minute segment will give you the entire data, and then the first page itself, Mohanji gives you all the references. I mean, you can take a snapshot of that and show it to people. Look, this is where it's compiled from, because this nonsense about creating a false narrative has taken a life of its own, and it's affecting us. It's self-esteem of our children, who they get caught like deer in headlights, and they don't know what to do, especially when they go to universities and face some hostile people coming up and telling them that you didn't even know such things existed. So we are hoping that this will educate you, your family, and hopefully you can spread this thing around to your networks, friends, relatives, whatever. Hopefully we have made a difference in your perception about meat and meat eating. Thank you so much, Mohanji. Wonderful work, sir.
Namaste. Namaste.